Thank you, Adam, for this brilliant presentation. This is my opportunity to introduce Greg Stephen, President of Windrose Partner, with a large and solid experience in clinical nutrition since Abbott Nutrition and other consulting companies. We will have an overlook in this exciting area as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Appreciate it. And thank you to the GOED staff for inviting me here. It's funny, I'm just reflecting on what an excellent, program and meaningful program it's been, and what outstanding speakers we had. And as soon as I stepped on the stage, Ben Stein flashed in my mind. And then I thought of Peter this morning saying, well, nobody under 40 would have any idea who Ben Stein is. But I just wondered, anybody have any idea what movie I'm thinking of? Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the deadpan, monotone Ben Stein. But anyway. What we're going to be talking about today is kind of omega-3s in the medical foods. And we'll take a look at the medical food market in general, just kind of an update on that, where it is. And then we'll talk about what medical foods are and are not. And I certainly didn't want to get into much detail on the regulatory aspects of it. That seems to be where we focus so much when we talk about medical foods of recent. How's that? Wow. I could have gone on the whole time and not even known that, So we won't have a whole lot of detail on the regulatory aspects of it, but I think it's very important that we do have that update. And then finally, talking about more specifics about omega-3s in medical foods, kind of the current aspects and some of the emerging opportunities. So I know when I've been to a GOED meeting in the past, some of the presentations that really fascinated me was always, looking at the historical perspective, going way back on omega-3s, and it's very fascinating, and it kind of got me to thinking about, well, what's the history, of medical foods? So I kind of did a little quick research on it, and one I came up with, in the U.S. anyway, was the use of medical foods in, I guess what might have been considered early medical foods in 1881, when Garfield was assassinated, and he survived for 79 days, almost 3 months, on what we might consider medical foods. I was going to ask you, can you think of what the formulation and the delivery mechanism might have been for this medical food? Just think about it for a second. Yeah, somebody else remembers that. He was given a rectal feeding of whiskey and partially hydrogenized beef and beef broth every 4 hours for 79 days. Now, see, I know what you guys are thinking. You're thinking, no PUFAs. You think if he would have had some omega-3s in there, the inflammation, he might have survived. You never know. But that was the extent of my research into the back history of it. But thinking a little more, currently, I think the real, beginning of medical foods was for addressing inborn errors of metabolism. It was probably back in actually late 1950s, but 1960s, when low-phenolac was introduced by Mead Johnson to develop, the product for kids and adults with PKU. That was kind of the beginning of the products, and not a whole lot happened in the medical foods arena until probably up, in the 1970s. And my background, as I may have mentioned before, is I'm a dietitian by background. I worked in the hospital a few years, then I realized I had to get out of the kitchen. So I ended up with Abbott Labs, which was Ross Laboratories at the time, in an era when the medical food was just really starting to grow. And in '73, Ross launched a product called Ensure, which was certainly marketed as a medical food, though when you look at the formulation of it and the way it was positioned, it's not a medical food as we know them today, certainly. And Mead Johnson, of course, had a product called Sustacal, and the market was doing very well. And that kind of led to a lot of launch of what we referred to at Abbott anyway as disease-specific products. So in the early 80s, right after I was brought on board, we were launching products that you may be familiar with. These were in the institutional setting predominantly, but like Pulmicare for COPD patients, Nepro and Suplena for renal patients. But, fairly narrow markets in the institutional setting, certainly wasn't drawing a lot of attention from the FDA, and that was kind of the foundation of where the medical foods were, and then where I really started to see them grow throughout the 80s. But what about the market? Again, we've seen numbers on the markets. there's a range of numbers that you see. And one of the reasons I think it's hard to get a handle on the medical foods market size is that a huge portion of it is institutional settings. And, Nielsen doesn't pick that up. So there's a lot of those sold in the institution. But, the global market, probably you see a lot of numbers between $9, $12 billion. Not an insignificant market. And in the U.S., it certainly exceeds $2 billion, maybe even getting close to $2.5 billion right now, and with some nice growth rate to it as well. But one of the things we've seen, I think, in the last, 4 years anyway, is just, some real growth in the product, a lot of new products. I think one of the reasons it kind of stayed under the FDA radar for all those years was, a product or two was being launched every year. It was controlled very heavily by doctors in institutional settings, and it wasn't much of an issue with the FDA. But then over the last few years, we're starting to see a lot of medical foods launched, to varying degrees of quality, if you will. Certainly the ones that, there's so many of them in this room, folks that are developing medical foods from the omega-3 platforms that are very, very good, high-quality products. Some not so much, though, in other arenas in the supplement area. The market in the U.S., I think is pretty much, when you look at it from a dollar standpoint, dominated by a couple of big players. Certainly Abbott Nutrition, as I mentioned, we know products like Pulmicare, Nepro, Soplena, OxyFit, and Nestle with the medical nutrition, therapeutic nutritional products that they have. When you get to Europe, obviously there's people like Nutricia and other companies. But again, where we're seeing a lot of the growth too are these companies, for instance, in the practitioner channel. Obviously, we've seen a lot from a regulatory standpoint of recent that we'll touch on briefly in a few minutes, but a lot of growth from the practitioner guys, and then a lot of startups with novel technologies, and that's where, again, I kind of group a lot of the products from the folks in this room that are developing, and, and other technologies as well. Seeing a lot of growth, a lot of new products coming from these platforms, and I know the folks at Abbott and Nestle, are looking very closely at those for partnership opportunities. So that's kind of sizing the market. I think to look at one other quick glimpse at kind of the evolution of the market that might make some sense too is just looking at it by distribution channel. Because as I mentioned before, most of those early medical foods were sold predominantly in the institutional setting, that being hospitals, nursing homes, and the home care setting. And these were products, that were clinical nutrition products. They were either orally fed or for tube feeding products. And, back in those days, too, in those early medical foods in the 80s, early 80s, it was a cost-plus environment in hospitals. So, no matter how much you sold, you just, marked it up, and you got reimbursed based on that. Obviously, healthcare costs, that contributed to the rapid increase in it. But around in the mid-80s, you recall, when prospective reimbursement came into play, hospitals started getting reimbursed on a capitated basis based on, DRGs. Well, it changed the medical food market along with the entire healthcare system pretty significantly as well. So we had been experiencing, 15, 20% growth a year, 10% price increases every year. It was a wonderful market for many years. And then all of a sudden, what happened in the hospitals, of course, since for every penny they saved was a penny in their pocket under capitated care, the patients were being discharged sooner. So the average length of stay started to decline. So the volume of products, being sold started to decline a little bit. And another thing that was happening, obviously, in the early days, you kind of sold the products through food service. The dietitian bought them, put them on the shelf, and that was the system, and it worked very well. And then formularies took over, and products started going out on bid. So all of a sudden, margins were shrinking, average length of stay in the hospitals were flat and declining, and sales, the brakes hit heavily. So I know at Abbott, we were having a lot of meetings like, what do you do now? What are the opportunities to jumpstart this again? And we, the logic was, well, people are discharged sooner from the hospital. Where are they? They're at home. Where are they buying products? Well, maybe retail distribution for medical foods is something we should consider. So during that period, and it was actually, in the early 90s, when this really kicked in heavy gear, products started being, stocked at retail. And these were mostly products like Ensure and some of the diabetic products that had the higher volume like Glucerna. And there was Sustacal products as well at that time. And it was a lot of growth. It jumped in significantly. Now, things that helped drive some of that growth was, we still had the hospitals discharging people, and we still had a lot of relationships with primary care physicians in their practices and the dietitians that were recommending the patients use them. So this was helping to drive retail sales along with folks like discharge planners. So if a patient was being discharged from the hospital, with a diagnosis of COPD, they were going to go home with a free 6-pack of Pulmicare. Obviously, the thought was that they would be picking it up at retail down the road. So that was part of it. And of course, there was a lot of direct-to-consumer promotion began as well at that time. And that's when I think for products like Ensure, the FDA began questioning now, is this truly a medical food? And not so much because, you're marketing it directly to consumers, because there was still that healthcare practitioner management side, but, what is the product? It's a basic milkshake that's not targeting a specific indication, but more, replacing blenderized feedings. So anyway, there were some changes at that time where some of those products became medical foods in the institutional setting, but adopted more of an NLEA food label in the retail environment. And the other one that I thought would be very relevant now to mention, is kind of that emerging health practitioner channel. We're seeing so much growth there, and I know the recent holistic primary care survey in 2013, we had a third of primary care physicians saying that they're actually dispensing nutritional products from their office. Now, to me that sounds kind of high, but I do know I have several friends that are physicians in the Philadelphia area, and these were guys that 2 years ago, were very skeptical even about omega-3s. And one of the physicians that is on the board at Jefferson came and he said, could you help us develop a line of supplements, that we'd like to put our hospital brand on it. But the point being, I think this practitioner channel is one that's off of a relatively small base, but has enormous opportunity for growth. I wanted to touch briefly on the reimbursement of medical foods, because I think that's there's some of the perceptions or misperceptions I think folks have about medical foods, and one of them is that, first is there's no regulation, sometimes people think, and secondly, once you get a medical food, you have automatic reimbursement, and that's not necessarily the case. Certainly some medical foods are covered when it's a medical necessity. Typically, it's more likely when it's sole source nutrition. Some medical foods are nutritionally complete, some are more elemental or non-nutritionally complete products, and that has some bearing on reimbursement as well. But I thought you might be just interested, the last data I had on reimbursement for nutritionally complete medical foods was something like for every 100 calories, calories that you were administering to a patient, you're getting like 40 to 67 cents per 100 kilocalorie. So if you do the math, and I'm just doing it in my head, even if it's a 2,000 calorie, it's $10. It's not as much as some people might think. They're thinking you're going to get kind of pharmaceutical reimbursement on medical foods. And again, that's on certain products that are already approved by Medicare that are nutritionally complete. Some of the more non-nutritionally complete products get reimbursement as well at a slightly higher level. Other coverages, from Medicaid and private insurance companies, just kind of summarizing them into a bucket. There may be coverage for those people that are getting medical foods out of medical necessity. And typically those are sole source nutrition patients as well, tube feedings. And there's some other sources of coverage too. I just mentioned some of the government programs that might provide coverage. So it's not a very simple area looking at reimbursement of medical foods. It's quite complex, and there are people that are specialists and have expertise in this area that kind of help you walk through it. Now we touch a little bit, I think, on the regulatory side of it. I mentioned we didn't want to go into a whole lot of detail, but I think it's relevant given the fact, too, that so much has happened over the last few months from the FDA perspective and medical foods. So we'll touch on it very briefly. To get that quick background of medical foods regulations, I think everybody can recall, prior to 72, medical foods, the products were perceived as medical foods, were regulated as drugs up until that point. And then in 72, they were removed from the drug category and put into the food for special dietary use. Subsequent to that, the Orphan Drug Amendment in 88 allowed the first classification of true medical foods and provided a definition for medical foods. And then the NLEA Act exempted medical foods from NLEA labeling requirements. So medical food labels, didn't have to have the nutrient fact panel as it's presented on NLEA, and that's pretty significant. And then again, in '96, some of you may recall, that was the first real time that there was an ANPR for medical foods to really provide regulations on medical foods. And I know when I was with Abbott, there was a lot of concern about this. And the good news, bad news, it just languished for quite a few years until the FDA kind of withdrew it in 2002, just saying, in paraphrasing it, there were a lack of resources and a shift in FDA priorities. So again, no real regulations on medical foods, no pre-market approval. But again, keep in mind, in that era, there weren't a lot of new products. They were being launched moderately, mostly, again, in hospital settings, and used very responsibly. So it wasn't that much of an issue. But then again, we started seeing this growth, as I referred to earlier, that we've all seen, so many medical foods being launched over the last 3 to 4 years. And, we saw some action, obviously, in 2013. Now, again, this is can be the subject of an entire presentation very easily, but we'll just touch on it very briefly. There was the draft guidance for the industry and the frequently asked questions at the FDA. Maybe many of you have read through those. I think one of the things that was kind of interesting to me, it really more narrowly defined medical foods, and one of the things was it specifically said, diabetic products aren't medical foods. Now, I've talked to the companies that have these products, because Abbott, has a $1 billion franchise in the Glucerna diabetic medical foods, and they don't seem overly concerned about it, but this is not a statutory issue. But nonetheless, there's a lot going on in this 2013 guidelines that got a lot of folks' attention. And my opinion was it was a way of the FDA, was kind of shooting a shot over the bow of some of these companies saying, don't think this is a Wild West, guys. This is a very vulnerable population, these sick folks, and, we're not going to have you taking advantage of it. So we saw some letters coming from the FDA. Of course, everybody remembers, I think it was it August, I believe, last year, Metagenics got a warning letter from the FDA on 14 of their medical food products that's still being addressed now. 2 of them that were more recent I thought were kind of interesting, and there have been others, but I just mentioned, there was the one for Acera, and a couple of the things that came out of the warning letter that the FDA provided was this first quote, there are no distinctive nutritional requirements or unique needs for individuals with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. And really and truly, there's nothing new there because, I remember 20 years ago with the HIV product that I may have mentioned earlier that we were launching, the FDA said the exact same thing. You showed clinical benefits that these patients received, but that's not enough. There are no proven and generally accepted nutritional requirements or unique needs that, in our case, the HIV patients had that the normal population didn't have. Or if they did, they could be met by modification of the normal diet. So again, the FDA uses that quite a bit. But interesting also, I noticed they just, in that same warning letter, they said, oh, and by the way, due to your reference, to raise ketone body levels, now your product is no longer GRAS for the above reference uses. And everybody knows, medical food products, the ingredients, unlike supplements, all have to be GRAS. And there was one other there it went. The NVN Therapeutics warning letter on their product, they actually stated in it, there are benefits to these patients in obtaining these functional ingredients. There's still no established nutritional requirements or inherent needs for patients with polyovary syndrome to have these substances in their diets. So again, I think there are a lot of folks following these kind of products as kind of the path, for medical foods. And now the FDA has given the warning letters, and there's a lot of discussion going on, obviously, on how to respond to some of these issues. So again, I think the point there is, just because there is not a pre-market approval required, don't make the assumption, that it's kind of a straightforward, no-brainer approach. And I do get calls at my practice, every week, several, from companies that just want to do the quick and dirty, medical food, get that disease name on the label, and let's get the product out there, see if we can get a little reimbursement. To tie that up, medical foods do not have to go pre-market approval or registration, but again, don't think it's the Wild West. And there is an FDA compliance program for medical foods, but again, it's focused more on safety type issues, particularly again, since we're dealing with some very vulnerable patient populations. I had put together a little table comparing, and I'd done it a little bit earlier before on dietary supplements and medical foods, just a couple of key areas for discussion. And I was having a discussion with one of my old colleagues, that's taking one of the omega-3 medical foods the pharmaceutical route at his company. And he's saying, why don't we add in this pharmaceutical column as well? Because, these are certainly options along with, more traditional NLEA functional foods using, qualified health claims. But nonetheless, I think the only ones that I even thought would be relevant to take a quick look at, cost to the consumer, dietary supplements, typically out of pocket. Medical foods, I just call it limited reimbursement. And a lot of the companies taking this route for a good reason, reimbursement is much more likely. And similarly, for claims, there's, no disease reference on dietary supplement claims. Those are intended, for healthy individuals. But, on medical foods, you can, or actually you must, put the name of the disease on the label of the product. So it's for the dietary management of, but in other words, it makes it easier to communicate the benefit to the consumer and to the healthcare professional as opposed to, trying to deal with structure function claims. And particularly, I think, when you're seeing so much action by the agency now on structure function claims like inflammation, is a very good example. So, they're thinking, okay, fine, there's opportunities here from the medical food pathway to communicate those benefits to the consumer and to the healthcare professional. And, I think, and of course, disease claims, from a pharmaceutical standpoint are generally accepted. So if you take that route, obviously you kind of know what you have, as opposed to taking maybe a medical food route where, the regulations are kind of vague. You could spend a lot of money in it, like a couple of companies that I have worked with have, and then realize that, oh, I'm not a medical food. So let's take a couple of minutes and talk about some of the omega-3 medical foods. I pulled a couple, and the friends at GOED had given me a good reference that linking some of the medical food products that currently contain omega-3s. And this is not an inclusive or exhaustive list. It was just a random list of some of the products out there. The point being, obviously, there are quite a few medical food out there currently that contain omega-3 products. I thought I would take just two of them. I know that I'm pretty familiar with just from the development standpoint and mention those. And this one, because it had an inflammation claim, and this was OxyFit. So the product is therapeutic nutrition for modulating inflammation. And this is just from the marketing literature. So the usage of OxyFit is clinically shown to modulate the inflammatory response in critically ill, mechanically ventilated, tube-fed patients, especially patients with systemic inflammatory response syndrome, acute lung injury, or ARDS. And you notice there's the research supporting that. All these products have pretty significant clinical research supporting it on the final formulation. Of course, used under medical supervision like any medical food is. And as far as the omega-3s in that particular product, I just pulled away from it, the ingredients that were specific to a medical foods. So on OxyFit, it has a unique oil blend containing 4.6 grams per liter of EPA and 4.4 grams per liter of GLA to help modulate inflammation. And then, of course, the clinical substantiation for that. So that's the OxyFit product as an example. One other real quick, and I thought it was relevant too because Adam was talking about cancer cachexia. There is a ProSure product. Again, this just happens to be one that Abbott has. Therapeutic nutrition for cancer-induced weight loss. And it's a product that's been around since probably 2000, I think. It's actually sold mostly outside of the United States. But it's a therapeutic product designed specifically for people who have experienced cancer-induced weight loss or those that are at risk for it. And I know I was looking at the clinical data back before the product was launched, and in the control group, there were people that were getting a controlled product like it was a standard insure, as I recall, was actually losing weight, and folks on this product maintaining weight, and some are actually gaining weight. And this product has in it 1 gram per 8-ounce serving, 1.1 gram of EPA is in the product. So, in summary, medical foods are here to stay, not so much because it's big business for these big pharma companies, but they serve a real purpose, for a patient population that has a need for them, and they have some very well-demonstrated benefits. The category is gaining a lot of renewed scrutiny by the FDA, so don't be misled by this no registration required. Reimbursement is unlikely or challenging at the best. It's not a no-brainer. But on the positive side, medical foods can really effectively leverage a company's relationship with healthcare practitioners. If you have a relationship with healthcare practitioners that can make those recommendations, it has a real phenomenal effect. And medical foods have a high level of perceived efficacy, certainly from healthcare professionals. When a product meets the requirements for a medical food, the ability to communicate that benefit, the disease on the label, is a very compelling benefit too from a marketing standpoint. There's a long-standing history of omega-3s in medical foods. I was looking at Adam's slide, and it goes back certainly to stage 2 or phase 2. I know I was making trips 25 years ago to Japan, sourcing Manhattan sourced omega-3s for structured triglycerides. And that was, again, 25 years ago. Obviously, the use of it in other products goes back much further than that. And the increasing breadth of research, the research that we've been hearing here, the ones that you guys live and breathe every day, there's so many opportunities. There is every organ in the body. The thing from a medical food perspective, obviously, is to make sure that there is a demonstrated nutritional requirement that can't be met through the modification of the normal diet. Those kind of things are very important from a regulatory standpoint, but the ones that have been proven certainly in that area, things that are systemic, from an inflammatory standpoint, neural development for the, peds, adolescent, preemies, and certainly for us baby boomers, the age-related memory declines are certainly some significant opportunities. So that was a very fast overview and discussion, but hopefully it generated some thought, and we can have, I guess, some questions now. Thank you.